Okay, today's Q&A is a question from a high school math teacher who's looking for examples of math where it could be used for halachic purposes. So the first thing that comes to mind is that if a little bit of non-kosher food gets mixed into kosher, or for that matter, milk into meat, then the mixture is okay if the non-kosher is batal b'shishim, if it's 60 times as much permitted item as non-kosher. So when you make that calculation, you have to use the way you calculate that is using the volume of the item, meaning how much space does it take up, rather than its weight. So, for example, flour is less dense than corn syrup, so a pound of flour has a much larger volume than a pound of corn syrup, because the corn syrup is more dense, so a pound of corn syrup takes up much less space. If you have the information only in weight and you don't have the volumes, then you can convert from weight to volume using something called specific gravity, which is a method of comparing densities of one item to another. Well, really, it compares everything to water. Water is considered a density of 1. Flour, let's say, for example, which is lighter than water, or has less dense than water, it might have a specific gravity of 0.6. And corn syrup, the opposite, is more dense than water. It would have a specific gravity of 1.4. So using specific gravity, you can convert the weight, the measurements you have in weight, into a measurement in volume to figure out this bittul. Now, what happens if you have non-kosher was cooked? If kosher food was cooked in a non-kosher pot? So now what? How much tam comes out of the walls of that pot to affect the food to see whether it's batal b'shishim or not? So what you have to do there, you have to calculate how much metal is in the pot. We work with an assumption that the blia is absorbed into all the metal of the pot. So you say, okay, how much metal was there in the pot? Well, how are you going to figure that out? So one way to do that is you calculate the volume of the interior of the pot and of the exterior of the pot. Okay, so the exterior is a little bit bigger than the interior. So you calculate those two differences. You subtract the interior from the exterior, which will tell you how much space the metal, which is the walls of the pot, how much it took up. Now you know how much blia there was, and now you can see whether it's batal b'shishim into the food. Okay, now a more complicated calculation happens when you think about kosher whiskey, which was aged in wine barrels. Wine is not batal b'shishim. It doesn't need 60 times its volume to be batal. It only needs 6 times, but the barrel walls are very thick. Now, to calculate the volume of the barrel is more complicated than for a pot, and that's because barrels have a bulge in the middle of them, which means you can't use a simple formula that we would use for a cylinder, because it's not a plain cylinder, it has somewhat of a bulge, so you need a more complicated mathematical formula to figure out the volume of those, and the volume of the walls, how much blia there is in the walls. Now, another time you might think about percentages is if you have a gluten-free cake or a low-carb bread or something like that, which has a small amount of one of the 5 primary grains, meaning wheat, rice, spelt, oats, or barley. So in the gluten-free case, it would be oats would be the only grain, but a low-carb cake might have any of the grains, just a small amount. But so you want to decide what the bracha achroina is. What bracha do you make after you eat that food? In many cases, you only make a bench or say an al hamichya if you ate a kazayis of grain, and you have to do it within a couple of minutes. And the way to figure that out is to measure the grain and compute whether you have a kazayis with the achilas pas. One last case comes up when you make chalav yisrael at a factory, and if you're making it at a factory that usually produces non-chalav yisrael milk. So in many cases, there's 2 things. It is basically impossible to kasher the huge milk silos, just so having to do with the way they're constructed. They can't handle the boiling water that you need for kashering. And the other thing is that the milk sits in the silo for more than 24 hours. There's a rule called kavush, which means that even without heat, flavor could be absorbed into and out of a container if the liquid sits there for 24 hours. So here we have this tank that absorbed non-chalav yisrael milk, and we want to use it for chalav yisrael, and we can't kasher it. So what do we do? So one way to avoid it is that before the 24 hours elapses, you don't let the chalav yisrael milk ever sit there for 24 hours. But if it has to, then what you do is, when it's before 24 hours, you start pumping the milk out, and then, you pump it right back into the same silo. So you pump it out of the bottom and pump it back into the top, or into a small tank temporarily, and then right back into the silo. And the So you think, well, at first you say, okay, no problem. If there's 6,000 gallons and we do 100 gallons a minute, then it takes 60 minutes to get all those 6,000 gallons out of the thing. But that's not really accurate because after you pump 100, after a couple of minutes, the milk that you're pulling out of the bottom includes some of the old milk, some of the milk that's already been circulated. So you have to use mathematical formula for that also to figure out how long do you have to run the pump of taking the milk out to circulate it to make sure you've got all the milks out and no milk has sat there for 24 hours.